Everett Caldwell snatched the paper from the last woman's hand before she could even read her own name. "Sold," he announced, snapping his fingers like she was livestock. "Every last one of you, except that one." He pointed straight at Rosalind May Harper, not with a finger, with contempt. The crowd in Copper Ridge's dusty square turned to look at her, all of her, and the laughter started slow, then swelled like a wave nobody tried to stop. Everett didn't flinch. He picked up her travel document, held it up between two fingers like it smelled bad, and dropped it in the dirt at her feet. "Nobody's paying for that," he said. "Not in this town. Not anywhere." If this story already has your heart pounding, stay with us. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss the stories we tell here. And before you go anywhere, drop a like and tell us in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? We want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that square in Copper Ridge, because what happened next? Nobody saw it coming. The morning had started with hope. That was the cruelest part of it. The hope. Rosalind May Harper had carried it all the way from Cincinnati, folded up small and tucked somewhere beneath her ribs where nobody could see it. She'd carried it on the 3-day stagecoach ride through red dust and scrub brush. She'd carried it when the wheels hit a rock outside of Millerton and sent her sliding into the woman beside her, a tiny blonde named Cecily who smelled like rosewater and didn't bother to apologize. She'd carried it even when the driver called out, "Copper Ridge, end of the line!" and she stepped down onto that hard-packed earth and saw the crowd already gathering. Hope, she had learned, was a stubborn thing. It didn't care how many times you'd been disappointed. It showed up anyway, uninvited, wearing the same stupid smile. There were 10 of them all together, 10 women who had answered the same advertisement in the back pages of various newspapers across the eastern states. Opportunities for women of good character. Western frontier brides. Sought by established men of property and industry. The wording had been careful, professional. It had not mentioned anything about standing in a town square while strangers looked you over like horses at auction. Rosalind had told herself it wouldn't be like that. She had been wrong. Everett Caldwell ran the whole operation from a wooden platform he'd had built 3 inches off the ground, just high enough to make sure everyone could see him. He was a narrow man with a wide hat and the kind of smile that only lived on the surface of a face. Mid-50s, silver at the temples. The sort of man who had learned very early that other people's discomfort was something he could use. "Ladies," he'd announced when they arrived, spreading his arms like he was welcoming them to a celebration, "welcome to your future." He had arranged them in a line, not unkindly. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to be obviously cruel. He was the kind who did it through logistics, through systems, through the way he organized a room so that some people were always going to end up on the wrong side of it. He had arranged them smallest to tallest, he said, so the men could see everyone clearly. Rosalind ended up at the far right end of the line. She was not tall. She was not small. She was what her mother had once called substantial, and what her aunt had called handsome in the right light, and what 3 different men in Cincinnati had called, with varying degrees of cruelty, too much. She was 28 years old, with dark hair that never sat quite right, and brown eyes that saw more than she ever said out loud. She had good hands, strong, capable, the kind that knew how to work. But nobody in Copper Ridge that morning was looking at hands. The first man to come forward was a farmer named Dobbins. He walked the line slowly, the way you'd walk through a market, and chose Cecily the Rosewater girl without much deliberation. Cecily looked relieved. Rosalind noticed that she didn't look happy, just relieved, like she'd passed a test she'd been dreading. The second man was a merchant. He chose a red-haired woman named Frances. The third was a cattle rancher, sunburned and quiet, who pointed at a young woman near the middle of the line and said simply, "Her," like he was ordering something off a menu. One by one, the line shortened. Rosalind stood at the end of it and kept her face very still. This was something she had practiced over the years, the stillness, the way you could hold your expression so flat that nothing showed through. People thought it meant you didn't feel things. It meant the opposite. It meant you felt them so much you'd learn to build a wall around the feeling to keep it from getting out and humiliating you in public. She counted the women leaving. 4, 5, 6. The crowd was getting restless in the way crowds do when they sense something interesting is about to happen. She could hear it in the murmuring, the way conversation shifted register. "How many left?" someone called out. "3," Caldwell answered, checking his ledger. 3 became 2 when a lumber merchant chose a woman named Dorothea. Then 2 became 1 when the last remaining man, a heavy-set farmer with kind eyes, who had been lingering uncertainly, finally stepped forward and offered his hand to a young woman named Nell. And then there was one. Rosalind. She stood alone at the end of the platform, and she felt the weight of every eye in that square settle on her at once. It was a specific kind of weight, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes it slightly harder to breathe. She had felt it before. She recognized it. Caldwell walked toward her, and he wasn't rushing. He held his ledger against his chest like a shield, and he looked at her the way you look at a problem you hadn't anticipated. Not angry, exactly, more like irritated by the inconvenience of it. "Miss Harper," he said, and his voice was loud enough to carry to the back of the crowd, which told her everything she needed to know about what he intended. "It appears we have a situation." "I can see that," she said quietly. "The other gentlemen have made their selections." He said gentlemen the way people say it when they don't entirely mean it. "And you," he glanced down at his ledger, then back up at her. "You remain unselected." Someone in the crowd laughed, then someone else. It spread the way. Laughter spreads when it's not kindness. "Now, I want to be clear," Caldwell continued, dropping his voice just slightly, which somehow made it carry farther, "that the company did its best to accommodate all parties. We cannot be held responsible for—" He paused, and that pause was a weapon. "Matters of fit." Matters of fit. Rosalind heard what he was actually saying. She heard it clearly, and she filed it away in the place where she kept all the other things people had said clearly while pretending to be polite about it. "I would suggest," Caldwell said, "that the most dignified course of action would be for you to accept a refund of your travel costs and return on the next eastbound stage. We'll issue a formal letter." "A letter," she repeated, explaining that circumstances beyond anyone's control. "I don't need a letter," Rosalind said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that, the steadiness of it. "And I didn't travel 3 days in a stagecoach to get back on one." A murmur moved through the crowd. Caldwell's expression tightened at the edges. "Miss Harper," he said, and now the pleasantness was wearing thin, like paint on old wood. "I understand this is embarrassing." "You don't understand anything about me," she said. Quiet. Still quiet. But something in the quietness had changed. That was when he picked up her travel document. That was when he held it between 2 fingers, let the crowd see it, and dropped it in the dirt. "Nobody's paying for that," he said. "Not in this town, not anywhere." The laughter that followed was the kind that gets into your bones. Rosalind did not move. She looked at the document in the dirt. She looked at Caldwell. She made herself breathe. She was deciding whether to bend down and pick it up, whether that would look like dignity or defeat, when the square went quiet. Not gradually. All at once. The way a room goes quiet when something large moves through the doorway. She heard it before she saw it. The sound of a horse that was carrying real weight, moving at the unhurried pace of something that didn't worry about what was in its way. Then the crowd shifted, people stepping back and to the sides, not because they were asked to, but because they felt instinctively that it was the correct thing to do. The man on the horse was enormous. Not in the exaggerated way of stories, not the way men get described as giants when they're merely tall. This man was genuinely, architecturally large, wide through the shoulders in a way that suggested he had been built for a specific purpose, with arms that had the particular density of someone who had spent years doing work that required them to be. He wore a coat that had seen better decades and boots caked with mountain mud. He had a beard that was neither trimmed nor neglected but simply was, the way a rock formation simply is. His eyes, when they found her across the square, were the color of old river stone. He did not look at Caldwell. He looked at Rosalind. "What happened here?" His voice was low, the kind of low that you feel more than hear. Nobody answered immediately. The crowd had the particular silence of people who were reassessing their situation. Caldwell recovered first. He had not survived this long in business by being easily rattled, and his smile came back quickly, though it fit differently than before. "Silas Vane," he said, and even saying the name seemed to cost him something. Didn't expect to see you down from the mountain. Clearly, Silas Vane dismounted, and the horse seemed to breathe easier without him. He was looking at the document in the dirt. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Rosalind again. That yours? Apparently not, she said, according to him. Silas turned his eyes on Caldwell. Just his eyes. He didn't move toward him, didn't raise his voice, didn't change his expression. He simply looked, and somehow that was worse. Explain, he said. Caldwell cleared his throat. The selection process is complete. All available brides have been matched with— I'm not matched, Rosalind said. The remaining— Caldwell started. She said she's not matched. Silas said it the way you'd say a fact about weather. Not angry, just final. She's— Unfortunately, the men present weren't— Caldwell was beginning to lose the thread of his composure, and Rosalind watched it happen with a kind of grim satisfaction she hadn't expected to feel. There were matters of, suitability. Suitability. Silas repeated the word and let it sit there between them. The gentleman had preferences, naturally. I have a preference, Silas said. The square went so quiet that Rosalind could hear the wind moving through the gap between the dry goods store and the post office. Caldwell blinked. I beg your pardon? Silas turned to look at Rosalind again. He looked at her the way she was not accustomed to being looked at, not measuring, not assessing, not finding her wanting. He looked at her the way you look at something you've already decided about. Her, he said. One word. The same word the cattle rancher had used, but it landed completely differently. I'll take her. The murmuring started up again, confused and uneasy. Someone near the back of the crowd said something that drew a few laughs, but they were shorter, less certain than before. Caldwell's composure was doing something complicated. Mr. Vane, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but perhaps you'd like to— There are matters of compatibility to consider. How much? Silas said. What? The fee. How much? Caldwell named a number. Silas reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a fold of bills that made several people in the crowd straighten slightly. He counted out twice the amount and set it on Caldwell's platform without ceremony. That covers whatever else you're going to try to find a reason to charge me, Silas said. We done? Caldwell stared at the money. The money stared back. There are documents. Sign them. Mr. Vane, sign them. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't even particularly forceful, but something in the way Silas said it made the option of not signing them seem very remote. Caldwell signed the documents. Rosalind stood very still while this happened. She was aware that she should have feelings about this, and she did in fact have many feelings, a considerable tangle of them. But the primary feeling, the one sitting at the front of everything else, was the sudden and vertiginous sensation of the situation having changed completely and without warning. She had been standing at the wrong end of a line, being publicly discarded, listening to a crowd laugh at her, and now someone had chosen her. She bent down and picked up her travel document from the dirt. She dusted it off with the side of her hand. Silas watched her do it. When she straightened up, their eyes met, and she noticed that up close his face was not what she'd expected. Not hard exactly. Weathered. There was a difference. Miss Harper, he said. That's my name. You willing to ride? It's a long way up. She thought about Cincinnati. She thought about the stagecoach. She thought about Caldwell's voice saying, nobody's paying for that, and the particular flavor of the laughter that had followed. I've come a long way already, she said. A little farther won't kill me. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, more like the corner of one, the suggestion of it. No, he said. I don't expect it will. He held out his hand to help her to the horse. She looked at the hand, large, scarred, the knuckle on his left index finger sitting slightly wrong, like it had been broken and healed crooked. And she took it. Behind them, Copper Ridge erupted. Not in celebration, in something more complicated, disbelief, confusion, and underneath it all, a thread of something that felt almost like outrage. The particular outrage of people who had decided how a story was supposed to end and were now watching it refuse to cooperate. Caldwell's voice rose above the noise. "Vane, this isn't finished." But Silas had already turned his horse toward the mountain road. Rosalind sat behind him, the reins and the crowd and Caldwell's voice all falling away behind her, and she pressed her lips together to keep the expression off her face. She was not going to let herself feel anything yet. She had learned not to trust good things until they proved themselves durable. But her hands, gripping the back of his coat as the horse moved forward, were steadier than they'd been in years. The mountain rose ahead of them, dark with pine and distance, its upper ridges lost in cloud. She had no idea what was waiting for her at the top. She had no idea who this man was. Not really, not yet. She knew only his name and the way he'd stood in that square, and the way he'd said her like it was the simplest thing in the world. From behind her, she heard Caldwell shouting something. She didn't turn around. The horse climbed, and Copper Ridge, with all its laughter and all its cruelty and all its certainty about what she was worth, fell away below them, like something she was finally allowed to leave behind. She breathed the mountain air and felt it cold and sharp in her lungs. She did not look back. The road up Black Ridge Mountain was not a road at all. It was more of a suggestion, a faint scar in the earth where enough boots and hooves had passed over the years to push the grass aside. It switchbacked through dense pine in the kind of darkness that felt intentional, like the mountain was trying to discourage visitors. The horse picked its way carefully, and Rosalind, sitting behind Silas with her hands gripping the back of his coat, focused on breathing steadily and not thinking about how steep the drop was on her right side. She had said, "A little farther won't kill me." She was beginning to reconsider that assessment. "How much farther?" she asked. She tried to make it sound casual. "Couple hours?" "Hours." "You asked." She hadn't expected conversation. He hadn't offered any since they'd left Copper Ridge, and she'd spent the first 40 minutes of the climb watching the town disappear below them and trying to sort through the wreckage of the last few hours. She was still sorting. It was a lot of wreckage. "The horse," she said. "Does it have a name?" A pause. "Dob." "Short for something?" "Short for Dob." She waited to see if anything else was coming. It wasn't. She shifted her weight slightly and a loose stone skittered off the path and down into nothing, and her hands tightened on his coat without her quite meaning them to. "I've got you," Silas said. He didn't say it the way people say things they're supposed to say. He said it the way he'd said everything so far. Flat, direct, like a statement of fact rather than a reassurance. She found to her surprise that it worked better that way. "I know," she said, which wasn't entirely true, but was the answer she chose to give. The temperature dropped as they climbed. She hadn't anticipated that. How quickly the warmth of the lower elevation became something that used to exist. The coat she'd worn on the stagecoach had been adequate for Copper Ridge. Up here it was doing its best and falling short. She didn't say anything about it. She had already asked about the horse and the distance, and she was not going to add cold to the list of complaints she was lodging with a man who had, roughly 90 minutes ago, paid double the going rate for the privilege of her company. But he noticed. She wasn't sure how. She hadn't moved any differently, hadn't made any sound, but about 20 minutes into the second hour of climbing, he reached into the bedroll strapped behind the saddle with one hand, keeping the reins in the other, and produced a blanket that smelled like wood smoke and pine sap. He passed it back to her without looking. "Wrap that around," he said. She looked at the blanket. She wrapped it around. "Thank you," she said. He didn't answer, which she was starting to understand was not rudeness. It was just him. The cabin emerged from the tree line the way things emerge from fog. Gradually, and then all at once. She'd been watching for it without knowing what she was watching for. And then there it was, and it stopped her breath for a second, not because it was grand, but because it was so thoroughly and completely there. Solid, like it had grown out of the mountain instead of being built on it. The logs were dark with age and weatherproofing, the roof steeply pitched to shed snow, a stone chimney at one end and a covered porch at the other, firewood stacked under the overhang in rows so precise they looked architectural. She had expected a shack. She had steeled herself for a shack. The word frontier had conjured in her mind a particular picture. Dirt floor, one room, the smell of something dead nearby. This was not that. Silas dismounted and she tried to do the same with more dignity than she achieved. Her legs, after hours in the saddle, had opinions about the situation that they expressed loudly and without diplomacy. She grabbed the porch post to steady herself and stood for a moment doing the silent internal negotiation between her body and her pride. "Legs'll come back," Silas said, leading Dob toward a small lean-to stable on the side of the cabin. "I'm aware of how legs work," she said. "Just saying." "I know what you were just saying." He disappeared around the side with the horse. She stood on the porch and looked at the mountains. The view from here, she hadn't been looking at it during the climb, being occupied with not dying, was something she didn't have language for immediately. The valley below was a green and gray patchwork, Copper Ridge a small smudge of brown in the distance, and beyond it, more mountains, range after range going blue and then bluer still until they became indistinguishable from sky. She stood there long enough for Silas to unsaddle Dob, water him, and come back around the corner. "You going to stand there all night?" he asked. Not unkind, just a question. "I was looking." He looked where she was looking. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "I know." There was something in that, in the "I know," that made her look at him instead of the mountains. He was looking at the view with an expression that was not quite what she'd expected. Not pride of ownership, something more like gratitude, the quiet, uncomfortable kind that people feel for things they haven't entirely deserved. She followed him inside. The interior of the cabin did not match its exterior in any way she had anticipated, and she stopped just inside the door and stood very still because her brain needed a moment to reconcile what her eyes were reporting. Books. There were books everywhere, on shelves built into the walls, stacked on a low table near the stone fireplace, piled on the floor beside a worn leather chair that sat at an angle suggesting it had been in that exact position for years. Not decorative books. Read books. Spines creased and pages bent, and in several cases held together with strips of leather because the original binding had given out. There was a rug, handmade. The colors faded, but the pattern still visible. There was a fireplace with a proper iron grate and a stack of split wood beside it. There was a table with 2 chairs. She noticed the 2 chairs. And on the table, a tin lantern and a clay mug that still had coffee in it from what looked like this morning. On one wall, a wooden instrument hung from a peg, a fiddle. Old, well-used, the finish worn smooth in the places where a player's arm would rest. She turned around slowly, taking it in. "You play?" she asked, nodding at the fiddle. "Used to." "What happened?" A pause. "Nothing happened. I just used to." He moved to the fireplace and crouched down to build the fire up from the banked embers, and she watched his back and decided not to push it. She set her travel bag down near the door. She'd had to leave her trunk in Copper Ridge, to be sent up when the supply wagon ran, which Caldwell had arranged with visible reluctance, and took off her coat and hung it on the hook beside the door, which seemed like the obvious place for it. Then she felt strange about the familiarity of that gesture, about walking into a stranger's house and acting like she knew where to put things. "I can hang that somewhere else," she said. Silas glanced over his shoulder. "That's what the hook's for." She left it there. He made food without asking if she was hungry, which she appreciated because she'd been hungry for 3 hours and was too tired to negotiate it. It was not a complicated meal. Salt pork, cornbread cooked in the iron skillet, a jar of preserved something that turned out to be green beans. But it was hot, and there was enough of it, and he didn't put it in front of her like a favor. He put it on the table like it was just dinner. They ate mostly in silence. Not uncomfortable silence, which surprised her. The fire was going well by then, and the cabin had started to warm, and outside the wind had picked up, but the logs held it at a distance. She was about to reach for the last piece of cornbread and stopped herself. He noticed. He pushed the skillet toward her. "Eat," he said. "I was going to offer it to you." "I made extra." She ate the cornbread. He poured coffee from a pot he'd set at the edge of the fire, 2 mugs, and set one in front of her without asking how she took it. Black was apparently how they were both taking it, which was fine. She'd been drinking it black since she was 17, because she'd never been able to afford the luxury of preferences about things like that. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You've been asking things since we left town." That wasn't a no. He looked at her over his mug. The firelight did something complicated to his face, made it look older in some places, younger in others. Ask. Why me? He set the mug down. He turned it slightly on the table, not looking at her, and she watched him decide how to answer. He was not a man who reached for words quickly. She got the impression words were something he used carefully, the way you use something you don't have infinite amounts of. Because, he said finally, you were still standing. She waited for more. Caldwell dropped that paper in the dirt, Silas said, and you didn't flinch. You didn't cry. You didn't beg. You just... He paused. Stood there like you'd been through worse, and you probably had. She looked at her coffee. That's it? What do you mean, that's it? That's why you chose me. Because I didn't flinch. It's more than most people manage. She sat with that for a moment. It wasn't the answer she'd expected. She wasn't sure what answer she'd expected. Something about her eyes, maybe, or some invented notion of her character that he couldn't possibly have determined from 20 feet away in a town square. This was different, more honest, more uncomfortable, in a way she couldn't entirely explain. I need to say something, she said. All right. I don't know you. You don't know me. We signed papers today that say we're going to... She stopped, found her footing again. I'm not someone who complains easily. I'm not someone who quits, but I'm also not someone who pretends things are settled when they're not. So I'd rather we understand each other clearly from the start. He was watching her steadily. I'm listening. I will pull my weight. Whatever needs doing up here, I'll learn it and I'll do it. I don't expect to be waited on. I don't expect things to be easy. She met his eyes. But I'm also not going to disappear myself for your comfort. I take up space. I always have. I'm done apologizing for it. A silence. The fire snapped. Good, Silas said. Just that. Good. No elaboration. No performance of acceptance. Just the word, like it was the only word the situation required and he'd used it correctly. She felt something shift in her chest. Not dramatically. The quiet way a door opens when you've been pushing on it so long you stopped expecting it to move. Sleep in the back room, he said, getting up and taking his plate to the basin. I'll take the chair. I'm not putting you out of your bed. I sleep in the chair half the time anyway. He didn't look at her when he said it. Not much of a sleeper. She wanted to ask about that, but read the way he was holding his shoulders, slightly drawn in, not open, and let it go. There would be time, if there was going to be time. And she supposed there was going to be time because the document was signed and the mountain was real and the coffee in her mug was cooling. The back room was small and smelled like cedar. There was a bed, a real bed, a wooden frame with a straw mattress and 2 heavy quilts, and a small chest of drawers and a hook on the wall and a window that looked east toward where the sun would come up over the high ridge in the morning. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the sounds of the cabin settling around her. The fire, the wind, the sound of Silas moving around in the front room, purposeful, quiet, the sound of someone who was careful with the space they occupied. She had spent 28 years being told in various ways and with various degrees of gentleness that she was too much, too big, too plain, too poor, too stubborn, too particular about things that didn't matter and not particular enough about things that did. She had spent 28 years in rooms where she was the wrong shape for the space available. She lay back on the quilts without taking them down, still dressed, too tired to do anything differently. On Black Ridge Mountain, with the wind doing what it wanted to the pines outside and the fire still going in the front room, she was not sure yet what she was. But for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, the room did not feel too small for her. She closed her eyes. She did not expect to sleep quickly. She was out in under 3 minutes. The morning arrived with cold and noise, the particular noise of a man who is trying not to make noise and not quite succeeding. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself, letting the strangeness of the ceiling above her resolve into memory. Right. The cabin. The mountain. Yesterday. She got up, splashed water from the basin on her face, fixed her hair adequately, if not perfectly, and went out to the front room. Silas was at the table with a mug, a map spread out in front of him, and the expression of someone who had been awake for a while. He glanced up when she came in. "Coffee's on," he said. "Did you sleep at all?" "Some." She looked at the chair. The blanket draped over it was slightly rumpled, but not particularly disturbed. "How much is some?" "Enough," he said, which she already understood was a door closing on that subject. So she poured her coffee and came to the table and looked at the map. It was hand-drawn, meticulous. The mountain and its surrounding ridges, trails marked in faded ink, elevations noted in small, careful numbers. She could see where the cabin sat, marked with a small square. Beyond it, going northeast, a section of the map had been drawn over with heavy cross-hatching, the kind you use when you want to indicate that something is there, but not what it is. She pointed at the cross-hatching without touching it. "What's that?" His hand moved, casually but purposefully, and folded the corner of the map over so the section disappeared beneath it. "Northern Ridge," he said, "rough terrain." She looked at where his hand rested on the folded corner. She looked at his face. He was looking at the remaining visible portion of the map with the studied concentration of someone reading something very interesting in a direction that was not where she'd pointed. She picked up her coffee and said nothing. She was good at saying nothing. She had spent years learning the particular skill of knowing which silence to fill and which to leave alone. This one she left alone, and she stored the cross-hatched corner of the map in the same place she kept other things she intended to come back to later. He taught her things that first week, not in any organized way. There was no schedule, no lesson plan, no patience for explaining things more than once. He showed her how the stove worked and how the water came from the spring uphill, and how to stack wood so it dried instead of rotting. He showed her which mushrooms in the woods near the cabin would kill you, and which ones were fine but tasted terrible. He showed her how to read the sky for weather coming over the eastern ridge, the specific color of cloud that meant you had an hour to get inside, and the specific color that meant you had 20 minutes and needed to not be particular about what you were doing when you got that 20-minute warning. She made mistakes. She stacked the wood wrong on the second day, and he didn't say anything about it, but she noticed him quietly restacking it that evening when he thought she wasn't looking, and she went back the next day and did it correctly. She let the bread burn on the fourth day because she'd gotten distracted trying to fix a loose board on the porch, and he ate the burned bread without comment, which somehow made her feel worse about it than if he'd complained. "It's too dark," she said, looking at the bread. "It's bread," he said. "Dark bread. Still bread." She laughed. It surprised her. The laugh, the ease of it, the way it came out before she'd decided to produce it. He looked up from his plate, and something in his face, the corners of it, the eyes, shifted just slightly. Not a smile, not yet, but the possibility of one. "I'll do better tomorrow," she said. "You'll do it different tomorrow. Whether it's better depends on the fire." That's very philosophical for breakfast. It's not philosophy, it's how bread works. But she caught it then. The absolute faintest upturn at the corner of his mouth. There and gone in half a second. She decided to count it. She was keeping a private tally of those half seconds. She was up to 4 by the end of the first week. The physical work of the mountain was harder than anything she'd done in Cincinnati, which had been plenty hard. Hauling water uphill, splitting kindling. He showed her how to do it, and she was terrible at first, the axe glancing off the wood in angles that made him wince slightly and say nothing, preserving food, maintaining the cabin against the constant project of weather and wildlife and time. Her hands, which had always been strong, became something more than strong. Her legs stopped arguing with the mountain and started negotiating with it instead. And in the evenings, after supper, Silas would sometimes read. He had an easy relationship with books. They were furniture to him, necessary furniture. He didn't make a production of it. He'd take one from the shelf and open it without ceremony, and the room would get quiet in a way that felt companionable rather than isolating. One night she took a book off the shelf herself, a collection of essays she recognized, a writer she'd read in Cincinnati, and sat in the other chair across from him and read it. He looked over once, saw what she was reading, and said, "Good one." "I know," she said. "I read it 6 years ago." "First time I read it, I disagreed with most of it," he said. "Read it again last winter and agreed with all of it. Couldn't tell you what changed. She looked at him over the book. You changed. He looked back at the page in front of him. Maybe, he said. She read her essay. He read his chapter. The fire did what fires do on mountain nights in autumn, which is work very hard and be worth every piece of wood you've fed it all day. Outside, somewhere on the high northern ridge, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing, slow and enormous, the sound of the mountain being exactly what it was. Rosalind Harper, who had spent her entire life in rooms that didn't fit her, in a chair across from a man who took up considerable space and somehow left room anyway, turned the page. She did not feel like too much. She felt, for the first time in a very long time, like exactly enough. The supply wagon came up the mountain on the third Thursday of every month, driven by a man named Pruitt, who had the build of someone who'd been doing hard physical work since childhood, and the conversational energy of someone who had been alone on mountain roads for too long between stops. He arrived with Rosalind's trunk strapped to the back, a sack of flour, 2 tins of coffee, a bundle of letters that turned out to be one letter addressed to Silas with no return name on it, and approximately 40 minutes of uninterrupted talking that covered the weather, a dispute between 2 ranchers on the lower valley, the price of sugar in Copper Ridge, and all delivered with the careful casualness of information that was not actually casual at all, the news that people in town were talking about Silas Vane and his new bride. Talking how? Silas said. He was unloading the flour, and he didn't stop doing it. Pruitt scratched the back of his neck. Oh, you know, various ways. Pruitt, there's some that say, He glanced at Rosalind, who was pulling her trunk off the wagon bed, and did not look up. That the arrangement wasn't entirely voluntary on her part. The flour sack went down on the porch with more force than strictly necessary. Is that so? Silas said. I'm just telling you what's being said. I'm not saying I believe it. Pruitt held up both hands. You know how a town gets when it doesn't have enough to do. Who's saying it? A pause. Word is it started at Caldwell's office. Rosalind set down the handle of her trunk and straightened up and looked at Pruitt directly for the first time since he'd arrived. Everett Caldwell is telling people I'm being held against my will. Pruitt looked deeply uncomfortable. There's a letter, he said. I heard. And again, I'm just the man who drives the wagon. There's a letter been sent to the county seat, making claims about the legality of the arrangement, about... He stopped. About what? Rosalind said. About whether a man of Silas's, reputation should be permitted to... He stopped again. He was clearly a man who had more experience transporting information than delivering it. Look, Mrs. Vane, the gist of it is that Caldwell's been talking to a lawyer, and the lawyer's been talking to the county clerk, and there's some question being raised about whether the papers Silas signed are valid, given certain technicalities. Silas had gone very still. It was a different kind of stillness than his usual quietness. Not the stillness of a man at rest, but the stillness of a man who is holding something in place by force. What technicalities? He said. Pruitt looked at the mountain behind the cabin. I think you probably know better than me, Silas. After Pruitt left, the quiet he left behind was heavier than the usual kind. Rosalind dragged her trunk inside and got it open and began unpacking with the precise, controlled movements of someone managing their own emotional state through the application of physical tasks. She shook out a dress. She folded a shawl. She placed her mother's hairbrush on the small chest of drawers in the back room and stood looking at it for a moment. Then she went back to the front room, where Silas was sitting at the table with the unopened letter in front of him, not looking at it. Are you going to open that? She asked. In a minute. Is it from Caldwell? No. He picked it up, turned it over. It's from a man named Greer, in the county seat. He set it back down. She sat down across from him. Silas, he looked at her. What does Caldwell actually want? She asked. Not the version where he's concerned about my welfare. The real version. The fire was burning low. He got up and fed it 2 more pieces of wood and stayed crouched in front of it for a moment, his forearms on his knees looking at the flames in the way that people look at fire when they're deciding how much of a true thing to say. The mountain, he said finally. She waited. He stayed where he was, not looking at her. 7 years ago, I was trapping the upper ridge, northeast face, above the tree line. I came down into a creek bed after a storm and the bank had slid. Big section of it, just gone. And underneath where the bank had been, he stopped. Started again. Silver, not a fleck, not a vein, a deposit. The kind that would make a man like Caldwell lose his sense of proportion entirely. Rosalind sat very still. I mapped it, Silas said. I recorded it. I filed a preliminary claim with the county because that's what you're supposed to do. Then He stood up from the fire, turned around, looked at her with the expression of a man who had rehearsed a story so many times in his own head that saying it out loud felt strange. Then I didn't do anything else. I let the claim sit. I didn't develop it, didn't sell the rights, didn't tell anyone. Why? Because I'd seen what it did. My father... He paused. There was silver in our county in Wyoming when I was 12. They found a deposit 6 miles from where we lived. In 2 years, the town was unrecognizable. My father's friend killed a man over a boundary dispute. 3 women I knew lost their husbands to mining accidents inside of 14 months. Everything that was worth keeping about that place got ground up in the machinery of other people wanting what was in the ground. He looked at his hands. I didn't want that here. Rosalind was quiet for a moment. Then, the cross-hatching on the map. He looked up. That first morning, she said, you folded the corner over, northeast ridge. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. How does Caldwell know about it? She asked. He's been trying to find out for 3 years. I've refused to sell him any portion of the mountain. He's had men up here, not on my land, just nearby, watching, taking samples probably. His jaw tightened. The preliminary claim is public record. He knows something's there. He just doesn't know exactly where or how much. And the legal letter? He wants the marriage invalidated, Silas said. If there's no valid marriage, I have no proper heir and no one to contest what happens to my holdings if he can get a court to rule against my claim on some technicality. He doesn't need to own the mountain. He just needs to own the rights to what's under it. Rosalind heard all of this. She sat with it. She turned it over the way she'd turned other difficult things over, methodically looking at each face of it. He's going to say you kidnapped me, she said, or coerced you, or that you're here under duress and anything you'd say in my defense can't be trusted. Silas sat back down across from her. He gets a judge to look at it a certain way. I lose the legal standing I've got. The claim gets reopened. He's already got the money to develop it. I don't. He wins by default. She looked at the letter on the table. Open it. He opened it, read it. His face did not change dramatically while he read it, but she was learning to read the smaller indicators, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his breathing changed when something landed badly. He set it down, and she reached across the table and picked it up. It was from a man named Harlan Greer, identified in the letterhead as an attorney retained by the Caldwell Commercial and Land Company. The language was formal and dense and very, very deliberate. And what it said underneath all the formal density was this. The marriage contract entered into by Silas Vane on the date in question was being challenged on grounds that the party described as the bride had been subject to conditions of duress and public humiliation that may have compromised her ability to give free consent. An investigation had been requested. A hearing had been scheduled at the county seat in 6 weeks. Silas Vane was invited, the word invited doing considerable work, to present evidence of the voluntary nature of the arrangement. If he could not, the contract would be voided. If the contract was voided, the preliminary land claim, which had been filed jointly under the married names per the original documentation, would revert to uncontested territory. Rosalind set the letter down. He's using me, she said, not with heat, with a kind of cold precision. He's using the fact that they humiliated me in that square as legal grounds to undo the one thing that got me out of it. Yes. That is, she stopped, because the word she wanted was not a word she used often, and the situation seemed to warrant precision rather than profanity. That is extraordinarily cynical. He's an extraordinarily cynical man. She stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the mountain, which was doing what it always did, being enormous and indifferent and aggressively present. Then she turned around. "I can go to the county seat myself," she said. "I can stand in front of any judge Caldwell puts in front of me and tell them exactly what happened, and exactly what I chose and exactly why. Let him argue duress to my face." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" "Because Caldwell's lawyer's good, and Caldwell's money is better. Because a judge in that county seat has been known to rule in ways that—" He stopped, chose different words. "Because a woman's testimony about her own choices can be made to look like a woman who doesn't understand her own situation, especially a woman who—" He stopped again. "Who what?" she said. She said it evenly, meeting his eyes. "Who came out there as a mail-order bride with no money and no alternatives," he finished. "He'll say you had no real choice, that any choice you made under those circumstances was made under duress. That's not true." "I know it's not true." "Then we make sure the truth is louder than his lawyers." He looked at her with something she couldn't entirely name. Not doubt, not dismissal. Something more complicated. Like a man who wanted very badly to believe something and was afraid of what it would cost him if it turned out to be fragile. "Rosalind," he said. It was the first time he'd used her name. Not Miss Harper, not a gesture in her direction. Her name. This could get bad. If he shows up here with legal authority behind him, and he will, he's been planning this, I don't know for how long, but longer than I realized. It won't be just paperwork. He'll bring men. I assumed. I'm not sure you understand what that means up here. This isn't a town with a sheriff and a courthouse down the road. What happens on this mountain, happens on this mountain, she finished. I know. I've been here 3 weeks, Silas, and I've been paying attention. He leaned back in his chair, rubbed his hand across his face, the way men do when they're tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. "I chose you," he said, "because you were strong. I didn't choose you to put you in the middle of something that could—" Stop. She said it firmly, but not unkindly. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Don't make a decision about my situation on my behalf and call it protecting me. I've had enough people make decisions about my situation on my behalf." She sat back down across from him, put her hands flat on the table. "Tell me everything, all of it. What you think Caldwell is capable of, and what you think he'll actually do, and what the 6 weeks between now and that hearing look like. Tell me all of it, and then we figure out what to do, together." He looked at her hands on the table, then at her face. "You sure?" he said. "I'm already in it," she said. "The question is whether we're in it the same direction." Something happened in his face then. Not dramatic. Nothing about Silas Vane was dramatic in the obvious way. But something settled, the way a load settles when a second person takes part of the weight. "All right," he said. He talked for 2 hours. She listened the way she'd learned to listen. Not just for what was being said, but for the shape of it. The places where the telling moved faster or slower, the things that cost him something to get out. He told her about the silver deposit, all of it, the size and the location, and his careful, deliberate decision to let it sit undeveloped. He told her about the 3 men Caldwell had sent up the mountain the previous spring, who he'd found on the upper ridge with sample bags and surveying equipment, and how he'd walked them back to the property line without violence, but with a clarity of intent that had apparently convinced them not to come back. He told her about the letter he'd received from Caldwell's office 6 months ago, proposing a business partnership that was not really a proposal, so much as a description of the future Caldwell intended to make happen one way or another. And then, slower and with more difficulty, he told her about his wife. Her name had been Clara. She had been here, this cabin, this mountain, 12 years ago. She had been the one who'd put up the curtains in the back room that Rosalind had taken down without quite knowing why, replacing them with a length of cloth she'd brought from Cincinnati. Clara had loved the view east, Silas said, the same view Rosalind's window looked out on. She had loved the fiddle music, which was why he'd played it, and why he'd stopped. She had gotten sick in the 3rd winter, and the mountain in March was not a place where you could get help fast enough. He said all of this in the flat, factual voice of a man who had spent years reducing something enormous into a shape he could carry without visibly staggering. Rosalind listened and didn't try to offer comfort, because she understood instinctively that comfort wasn't what this was. It was information. He was giving it to her because she'd asked for everything, and everything included this. "I'm sorry," she said when he was done. "It was a long time ago." "That doesn't make it shorter," she said. He looked at her, one of those long, level looks. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She thought about the curtains she'd taken down. She almost said something about them, almost apologized, and then decided against it. She would put up others, better ones, different ones. The cabin was not a museum. "Caldwell knew her?" she asked. "Not well. But he knew of her. He knew when she died." He waited. Silas's voice tightened briefly. "About 2 months. Then he made his first offer on the mountain rights while I was still—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Rosalind felt a particular kind of anger come up in her then. Not hot, not impulsive, but cold and clear and durable. The kind that didn't burn itself out quickly. The kind that was useful. "He's been waiting for a moment of weakness," she said, "and he thought the bride situation gave him one. He thought I'd either be distracted or embarrassed enough by the arrangement that I wouldn't be paying attention to what he was doing legally. Instead, you paid double and brought me home," she said. A pause. And then, full, unhurried, real, Silas Vane smiled. Not the corner of the mouth half-second she'd been tallying. An actual smile, the kind that rearranged his whole face and made him look years younger and more than slightly dangerous in an entirely different way than before. "I suppose I did," he said. She looked at him in that new configuration for a moment, filed it away somewhere more significant than the tallies she'd been keeping. "Then here's what we do," she said. She pulled the letter toward her and smoothed it flat on the table. "We write back to this Harlan Greer and we request an extension on the hearing. We cite travel conditions, which are real. We use the time to document the deposit properly, officially, thoroughly, so that your claim is airtight before anyone tries to contest it in court. And I start writing my own account of what happened in that square, of what I chose, of why. Like a man who kept expecting the situation to be one thing and kept finding it was something else. You think like a lawyer," he said. "I think like a woman who spent 10 years watching other people's situations get decided by people with more resources and less stake in the outcome," she said. "I learned to plan." He nodded slowly, reached across the table and picked up the letter, read it again, put it down. "The extension they might grant," he said. "The documentation, that's harder. I'd need a surveyor, someone who'll file the right paperwork at the county seat, someone Caldwell can't get to." He said the last part with the tone of a man who understood how many people in a small county Caldwell had access to. "Do you know anyone?" "There's a man in Millerton, Felder, old enough that he doesn't care about Caldwell's money and stubborn enough that he couldn't be bought even if he did." He paused. "We haven't spoken in 4 years." "Why not?" A pause that said there was a reason and it was complicated. "We disagreed about something." "About what?" Another pause. "About whether I was handling Claire's death correctly." She waited a moment. "Was he right?" Silas looked at the table. "Mostly," he said, which she suspected cost him something real. "He mostly was." "Then write him," she said. "People who are mostly right about hard things are worth swallowing your pride for." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he got up and went to the shelf where he kept paper and ink and brought them back to the table and sat back down. "You write well?" he asked. "Better than you, I suspect," she said. He considered this. "Probably fair," he said, and pushed the paper and ink across the table to her. Outside, the wind moved through the high pines the way it always did in the late afternoon. Restless, picking up, the way it did before something changed. Rosalind dipped the pen and started writing, and Silas sat across from her reading the letter from Greer again, with the focused look of a man studying an opponent, and between them on the table the fire from the lantern threw 2 shadows against the wall that moved together when the flame shifted. The mountain didn't care about Caldwell's plans. It didn't care about silver or legal claims or the schemes of narrow men with wide hats. It had been here long before all of them, and would be here long after. But the 2 people at that table, working in the lamplight while the evening came down cold and clear over Black Ridge, they were beginning to understand what they had, And somewhere below them on the road that wasn't really a road, Rosalind was certain, with the cold, clear certainty of someone who had learned to trust her own instincts precisely because ignoring them had cost her so much, that Everett Caldwell was not finished. He was, in fact, just getting started. Felder wrote back in 8 days. The letter arrived with Pruitt on his next run, tucked between a sack of dried beans and a notice from the county about road maintenance that nobody on Blackridge Mountain had requested or required. It was short, half a page, in handwriting that was small and cramped and very precise, the handwriting of a man who did not waste paper. Silas read it at the table while Rosalind stood near the window, pretending to look at the mountain. She heard the paper settle. "Well," she said. "He'll come." Silas set the letter down. 2 weeks. He says if I'm finally ready to stop being a stubborn fool about the claim, he supposes he can make the ride up. That's his exact wording? More or less? Do you like him? Silas considered this with more seriousness than the question probably required. I respect him. That's harder to come by. It is, she agreed. She had spent the 8 days between sending the letter and receiving the response doing what she'd said she would do, writing. Every morning after breakfast, while Silas was outside doing whatever the mountain demanded of him that day, she sat at the table with her paper and her ink, and she wrote out her account of what had happened in Copper Ridge. Not the version that made her look noble, not the version that smoothed over the humiliation of it or softened the edges of what Caldwell had said and done. The real version. The version where she had stood at the end of that line, counting the women leaving and keeping her face very still and feeling the weight of every eye in that square settle on her like something she'd been handed without asking for it. She wrote it because accuracy was a weapon and she intended to use it. She also wrote letters. To the women who had been in that line with her, Cecily, Frances, Nell, the others she'd exchanged maybe 20 words with during the 3-day stagecoach ride. She wrote carefully, not asking them to lie, not asking them to risk anything they weren't willing to risk. She asked only whether they would be willing to state, in writing, what they had witnessed, what Caldwell had said, how he had said it, whether it had seemed to them like the actions of a man conducting a legitimate business arrangement or like something else. She didn't know if any of them would answer. She sent the letters anyway. 2 did answer before Felder arrived. Frances, the red-haired woman, wrote 2 dense pages that made Rosalind sit down and exhale slowly when she finished reading them. And a woman named Margaret, who had barely spoken on the stagecoach and whom Rosalind had not known well enough to expect anything from, sent a single page that was short and direct and devastating in its specificity. Margaret had been standing close enough to Caldwell to hear things the rest of the crowd had not, and she had written them down with the recall of someone who had been paying very careful attention. Rosalind added both letters to the file she was building. She did not yet tell Silas everything it contained. She wanted it to be more complete first. She wanted it to be the kind of thing that could not be argued with. Felder arrived on a gray morning that smelled like incoming weather, on a mule that suited him, compact, deliberate, unbothered by the opinions of others. He was 60-something, with white hair and a face that had been outside in all conditions for the better part of 4 decades. And he wore spectacles on a cord around his neck that he put on and took off with the regularity of someone who had made a specific accommodation with his own eyesight and resented it. He looked at Silas when he dismounted and said, "You look older." "You look the same," Silas said. "That's because I've been living sensibly." He turned to Rosalind, put the spectacles on, and looked at her with the frank assessment of a man who had decided long ago that pretending not to observe things was a waste of everyone's time. "You're the wife." "Rosalind," she said. "Felder." He shook her hand with the grip of someone who had been shaking hands with people he needed to take seriously for 60 years. "You're the one who wrote the letter." "I wrote part of it." "I know. The grammar was better in some sections than others." He looked at Silas. "Show me the deposit." They spent the better part of 2 days on the northeast ridge. Rosalind didn't go the first day. It was rough terrain, Silas said, and Felder needed to be able to move fast to take his measurements, and she accepted this without argument because she could see it was true and because she had other work to do. But on the second day, when they came back down for midday, and Felder spread his notes across the table and began explaining what he'd found, she sat across from him and listened to every word. The deposit was larger than Silas had mapped 7 years ago. That was the first thing Felder said, in the tone of a man delivering news he found professionally interesting and personally complicated. The creek erosion has exposed more of the upper seam, he said, tracing a line on his own sketch. What you recorded was accurate for what was visible at the time. What's visible now, he put the pencil down. It's a significant find, Silas. I don't think you understood the full scale of it when you filed. Silas looked at the sketch. How significant? The kind of significant that explains why Caldwell is willing to spend money on lawyers. Felder folded his spectacles and held them in one hand, turning them over slowly. The kind of significant that would change the character of this entire valley if it were developed. The three of them sat with that for a moment. That's what you were protecting, Rosalind said to Silas. Not a question. Trying to, he said. He wasn't wrong to, Felder said, which seemed to cost him something, acknowledging it after 4 years of disagreement. I thought he was being... He stopped. I thought the decision not to develop was coming from grief rather than judgment. I told him so. I was not entirely diplomatic about it. You called me a coward, Silas said. Flat, no particular heat. I called you a man who was using practicality as an excuse to hide, Felder said, with the precision of someone quoting themselves accurately. There's a distinction. There isn't much of one. There is. A coward is afraid of what might happen. What you were doing, Felder put his spectacles back on and looked at Silas over the rims, was avoiding what you knew would happen. You'd seen it. You knew what that much silver does to a place. It wasn't cowardice. It was a choice. I disagreed with it. I still think the right management of it could have been... He stopped. But that's not the conversation we need to have right now. No, Rosalind said. It isn't. She put her hand on the file she'd been building. Right now the conversation we need to have is how we go to that hearing in 4 weeks and make it impossible for Caldwell to win. Felder looked at the file. What's in there? She told him. He put his spectacles on properly and read through it slowly. Her account, Francis's letter, Margaret's letter, the correspondence with Greer, the original marriage documents, and a chronological record she'd assembled of every interaction Silas had documented with Caldwell going back 3 years, which Silas had provided from his own notes in the cramped handwriting of a man who had not necessarily been writing for an audience, but had been thorough anyway. When Felder finished, he set the file down and was quiet for a moment. This is good, he said. This is better than good. It's not complete, Rosalind said. What's missing? A character witness, someone who isn't me or Silas who can speak to the voluntary nature of what happened in Copper Ridge. Someone who was there. She paused. I have 2 women who can write to it, but written testimony from women who have no legal standing in the county can be dismissed. I need someone who is physically present, who can stand up in that courthouse and say what they saw. Felder looked at her, then at Silas, then back at her. You've been thinking about this for a while. I've been thinking about it since the morning after I arrived, she said. I didn't know all the pieces yet. I know more now. Pruitt, Silas said. She looked at him. He was there, Silas said. He makes supply runs through Copper Ridge. He was in that square. I saw him. He paused. He's not a man who likes conflict. No, she agreed, but he's a man who doesn't like injustice. I've spent 3 months watching him deliver things up this mountain, and I've heard how he talks about Caldwell, and it's not the talk of a man who has any affection for him. Asking Pruitt to testify against Caldwell in that county means asking him to make an enemy of a man with resources and a long memory, Silas said. I know what I'm asking, Rosalind said. I'm going to ask it anyway and let him decide. Silas looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as his version of being impressed, which was not dramatic, which looked almost exactly like him looking at anything else, except for a very slight quality of attention that was different from his ordinary attention. She had learned to read it over the weeks. She read it now. All right, he said. Felder stayed 4 days. He ate their food and slept on a bedroll by the fire, and during the days he finished his survey of the Northeast Ridge and began preparing the formal documentation for a full claim amendment, the kind of paperwork that, once filed correctly with the right signatures in the right offices, would be considerably harder to challenge than the preliminary claim Caldwell had been circling for 3 years. On the last evening, after supper, Felder poured himself the last of the coffee and said, without particular preamble, "You're good for him." Rosalind was washing the plates. "I'm good for the bread anyway. It stopped burning." "That's not what I mean." "I know it's not." She set a plate on the drying rack. "He's good for me too, if it matters." "It matters." Felder was quiet for a moment. He was, after Clara, he was not, he was here, but he wasn't present, if you follow me. Like a lamp with the wick turned all the way down. Enough light to see there was a lamp, not enough to see by. She didn't say anything. She dried the plate. "He's turned up again," Felder said. "I don't know if that's you or time or both, but it's visible." She put the dry plate on the shelf and turned around. He loved her very much. He did, still does, in the way you love things you can't get back. That doesn't... Felder stopped, tried again. "That doesn't have to be in competition with anything else." "It isn't," she said simply. "I know what I came into. I'm not trying to replace anything." Felder looked at her over his spectacles for a long moment. "No," he said. "I don't think you are." He left the next morning before the light was fully up, the mule picking its way back down the path with the methodical confidence of an animal that had done this many times. Silas stood on the porch and watched him go. Rosalind stood beside him. "Thank you," Silas said, when Felder was far enough down that he probably couldn't hear it. She wasn't sure if he was talking to Felder or to her. She decided it didn't matter. They had 3 weeks until the hearing. They used them. Pruitt said yes. He didn't say it easily. There was a long silence on the porch of the cabin when Rosalind asked him on his next supply run, and she watched him wrestle with it visibly, his hat turning in his hands, his eyes on the mountain. But he said it. He said Caldwell had always made him feel like a piece of equipment, and a man got tired of being made to feel like a piece of equipment, and if standing up in a courthouse could do something about that, well, he supposed he could stand. She filed Felder's amended claim documentation through Millerton, not through Copper Ridge, not through any channel Caldwell controlled or monitored. Silas rode to Millerton himself and stood in the county registrar's office until the clerk had stamped every page. He came back with the stamped copies in his coat and put them on the table without ceremony, and she looked at them and they both understood what they represented. Caldwell responded within the week, not with another letter, with men. 3 of them came up the mountain road on a Tuesday morning while Silas was on the upper ridge checking a trapline and Rosalind was alone in the cabin. She heard the horses before she saw them. The sound of more than one horse on that road at something faster than the careful pace the trail required, which told her immediately that whoever was coming wasn't being careful, which told her more than that. She put the bread she'd been making on the back of the stove. She went to the window. 3 men. Not Caldwell's, and he would not come himself for this. She understood that about him by now. These were hired men, the kind whose faces were forgettable in the specific way of men who made their faces forgettable on purpose. The one in front had a piece of paper in his hand. Legal paper, the long kind, folded twice. She went to the door and opened it before they reached the porch. "Mrs. Vane," the front man said. He didn't introduce himself. He held out the paper. "This is a writ of civil inquiry authorized by the county court, requiring you to present yourself at the county seat on the date of the scheduled hearing and to submit to examination regarding the circumstances of your marriage." She took the paper, read it. It was exactly what he'd said it was. And it was also something he hadn't said. It was a document that referred to her, in its second paragraph, as a party potentially unable to represent her own interests due to conditions of isolation and undue influence. She read that phrase twice. Then she folded the paper back the way it had been. "Tell Mr. Caldwell," she said, "that I will be at the county seat on the date of the hearing. Tell him I will submit to any examination the court requires." She paused. "And tell him that I read carefully." The front man's expression didn't change. "I'm not a messenger for Mr. Caldwell, ma'am. I'm an officer of the—" "You're a man who rode up this mountain with a piece of Caldwell's paper on a Tuesday morning," she said. "Tell him what I said." She closed the door. She stood with her back against it for about 30 seconds, breathing. Then she went to the stove and checked the bread. Silas came back down at midday and she told him what had happened. His expression went through several things rapidly, most of which had to do with the fact that she had been alone on the mountain with 3 strangers and he had not been here. "They didn't threaten you?" he said. "They served a legal document, politely." She put food on the table. "Sit down, Silas. If he sends men up here while I'm—" "Sit down." He sat down. He sat down the way a large person sits down when they are doing it purely by decision rather than inclination. "We knew he was going to escalate," she said. "This is escalating. It's still legal. That's actually good for us, Skug. As long as it stays legal, we have the better legal position. The moment it stops being legal, he stops being able to win in a courtroom, which is where we're going to beat him." Silas looked at his food, didn't eat it. "I don't like you being alone up here." "I'm not always going to be alone up here," she said. "But when I am capable of handling whatever comes up the road." She paused. "I handled you, didn't I?" Something flickered in his face. "That's different." "How?" He opened his mouth, closed it, picked up his fork. "Eat your food," he said, which was a complete abandonment of the argument, and they both knew it. She ate her food. She did not smile about it. She smiled about it internally, which was good enough. The night before they were due to ride down to Millerton and take the stage to the county seat, neither of them slept much. She could hear him in the front room, not pacing. Silas was not a pacer, but the specific quality of the silence that meant he was awake and thinking. She lay in the back room staring at the ceiling she'd memorized over the weeks and went through the file in her head. Every page, every letter. Felder's survey, Pruitt's agreement, Francis and Margaret's accounts, her own written record. She thought about Everett Caldwell standing on that platform in Copper Ridge with her travel document between 2 fingers, dropping it in the dirt. She thought about the crowd laughing. She thought about standing at the wrong end of a line and holding her face very still and deciding not to flinch. She thought about the things Silas had said early on when she'd asked why he chose her. "Because you were still standing." She sat up, put her feet on the floor, reached for her coat in the dark. She went out to the front room and Silas was in his chair, not reading, just sitting the way he sat when he was thinking hard. He looked up when she came in. "Can't sleep," she said. "No," he agreed. She sat down in the other chair. The fire was low. Neither of them moved to add wood. "I'm not afraid of tomorrow," she said. He looked at her. "I want to be clear about that," she said. "I am not afraid of the hearing or Caldwell or his lawyers or any of it. I want to say that out loud before we go, because once we're down that mountain and in that room, I need you to know it without me having to say it." Silas was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "Do you?" "I've known since Copper Ridge," he said. "I saw it when you picked up that paper off the ground." He paused. "I'm not afraid of the hearing either. I'm afraid of—" He stopped. "Of what?" He looked at the low fire. "Of not being enough. For what you deserve out of this. If Caldwell wins on some technicality I didn't see coming, then we deal with it," she said. "That's what we do. You'd have nothing. You'd be back where you started. Silas." She said it the way he'd said her name that first time, fully, directly. "I was not nothing before I came here. I am not nothing now. Whatever happens in that courthouse, I am not nothing." She looked at him steadily. "And neither are you." The fire made its small sounds. Outside, the mountain breathed. He reached across the space between the chairs and put his hand over hers, where it rested on the armrest. Just that. A large hand over hers, still and certain, the crooked knuckle of his left index finger pressing slightly against her skin. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that until the fire went dark and the room went cold, and the sky outside the window began, very slowly, to suggest that morning was approaching whether they were ready for it or not. At first light, she packed the file. She put on her best dress, which was not elaborate but was clean and well-fitted, and said what she needed it to say about the kind of woman she was. She came out to the front room and Silas was already up, already dressed, his coat on and his hat in his hands, looking like a man who had made a decision about something and intended to see it through. He looked at her. "Ready?" She picked up the file. Let's go take back what's ours. They walked out onto the porch together. The mountain was bright with early light, the kind that makes everything look sharper and more itself than usual. Below them, the valley floor was still in shadow, and Copper Ridge was a small dark smudge in the distance, and beyond it the road to Millerton, and beyond that the county seat and the courthouse, and Everett Caldwell, with all his lawyers and all his money and all his certainty about how this story was going to end. Dobbs shifted in the lean-to stable, impatient or eager or both. Rosalind did not look at the mountain behind her as they left. She looked forward, the way she had on the day they'd ridden up, not out of fear of what she was leaving, but because what mattered was ahead of her, and she intended to meet it straight on. The county seat was a town called Harlan's Fork, 3 hours by stage from Millerton, and it was larger than Copper Ridge in the way that places with courthouses tend to be larger, not because they were necessarily more prosperous, but because they had accumulated the particular density of people who needed to be near official things. Banks, lawyers' offices, a hotel with 2 floors and a dining room that served food at regulated hours, whether you were hungry at those hours or not. Silas had not been to Harlan's Fork in 4 years. He walked through it with the slightly compressed quality of a large man in a small space, not uncomfortable exactly, but aware of being somewhere that had not been built with him in mind. Rosalind walked beside him with the file under her arm and her chin level and her eyes taking in everything, which was how she moved through all new places, cataloging, assessing, storing. They checked into the hotel the evening before the hearing. 2 rooms. The clerk at the desk, young, with the careful blankness of someone who had been trained not to react to things, gave Silas a key and then gave Rosalind a key and said nothing about anything. In the hallway outside their rooms, Silas said, "Get some sleep." "You too," she said. "I'll try." She looked at him. "Silas, we have what we have and we've done what we can do, and tomorrow it either works or it doesn't. Lying awake won't change the file." "I know that." "Do you?" "I know it, and I'm still going to lie awake," he said, with the honesty of a man who had stopped pretending about his own habits. "That's different from not knowing it." She almost smiled. "Fair enough." She did not sleep well either, but she slept, which was something. In the morning she dressed carefully, ate the hotel breakfast without tasting it much, and went over the file one more time at the small desk in her room, while the town outside her window conducted its early business with no particular interest in what was about to happen in the courthouse 3 blocks east. Felder was already there when they arrived, standing outside the courthouse steps with his mule tied to the post and his spectacles on his nose and the expression of a man who had been waiting long enough to have formed opinions about the architecture. Pruitt arrived 7 minutes later, hat in hand, looking like a man attending something he'd agreed to in a moment of courage and was now processing in real time. "You came," Rosalind said. "Said I would," Pruitt said. "I don't say things I don't mean. Most of the time." He paused. "I'm going to need a drink after this." "I'll buy you one," she said. Caldwell's party arrived 2 minutes before the scheduled hour, which was calculated, late enough to be deliberate, early enough to be legal. He had 2 lawyers with him, a man Rosalind didn't recognize who had the bearing of someone important, and 4 other men who appeared to serve no specific function except to be present in the specific way that hired presence communicates available force. Caldwell himself was dressed in a suit that had cost someone real money, and his hat was his usual wide-brimmed variety, and when he saw Rosalind on the courthouse steps, he smiled the surface smile that never reached anything behind his eyes. "Mrs. Vane," he said, making the name sound like a question. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, making it sound like a period. His eyes moved to the file under her arm. Something shifted in his expression, briefly, before the surface reasserted itself. They went inside. The judge was a woman, which nobody in Caldwell's party had expected. Rosalind could see it in the way Harlan Greer, the letter-writing lawyer, adjusted his posture when she entered. Her name was Judge Aldine Marsh, and she was somewhere in her 60s, with steel gray hair pulled back and the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have spent decades in rooms where everyone watches them. She sat down, arranged her papers, and looked at both parties with equal lack of expression. "This is a civil inquiry into the validity of a marriage contract," she said. "It is not a criminal proceeding. I will hear from both parties, And from any witnesses presented, I expect everyone in this room to conduct themselves accordingly." She looked at Caldwell's lawyers over her glasses. "That includes you, Mr. Greer?" Greer smiled thinly. "Of course, Your Honor." Caldwell's case was what Rosalind had expected, which meant she had prepared for it precisely. Greer presented it methodically: the circumstances of the selection process, the public nature of the humiliation Rosalind had endured, the suggestion that a woman in her position with no money and no alternatives in a frontier town had been in no condition to freely choose anything. He used the phrase conditions of vulnerability 4 times. He used the phrase undue influence twice. He produced a signed statement from a man Rosalind had never heard of, who claimed to have witnessed Silas Vane approach Rosalind before the selection process began and make unspecified promises. The statement was 2 paragraphs long and vague in the specific way of things that have been made up carefully. Rosalind wrote 1 word on the corner of a page and slid it to Silas: lie. He looked at it, wrote under it, obviously. She almost laughed. She kept her face neutral. When Greer finished, Judge Marsh looked at Rosalind's side of the room. "Mrs. Vane, you've chosen to represent your own interests in this proceeding." "I have, Your Honor. That's unusual." "I'm aware of it." Rosalind stood. "May I approach?" The judge nodded. She put the file on the edge of the judge's bench, not pushing it forward, not making a production, just placing it where it could be seen. Then she turned to the room and said what she had come to say. She did not read from notes. She had thought about whether to and decided against it because notes implied uncertainty, and she was not uncertain. She spoke from the thing she'd been building for weeks, which was not just paper but understanding of what had happened to her and why, and what it meant, and what she intended about it. She described the square in Copper Ridge. She described the line of women, the selection process, the crowd. She described Caldwell dropping her travel document in the dirt, and what he said when he did it, and how the crowd responded. She described it without self-pity and without editorializing because she had found, in the writing of it, that the plain facts were more damaging than any embellishment she could add to them. Then she said, "I was humiliated, publicly, deliberately, by a man who calculated that my humiliation would make me compliant. He was wrong. I chose to stay. I chose Silas Vane. Or, more accurately, I chose not to be driven off a mountain by a man who dropped my name in the dirt because nobody wanted to buy it." She paused. "That is not the choice of a woman under duress. That is the choice of a woman who is angry and knows her own mind." One of Caldwell's lawyers shifted in his seat. She called Pruitt first. He sat in the witness chair with his hat on his knee and his hands folded, and he told what he had seen in plain, unadorned language that had the ring of someone who was not comfortable lying in a courthouse. He confirmed the events. He confirmed Caldwell's words. He confirmed that Rosalind had been standing alone before Silas arrived, and that nothing in her manner when Silas chose her suggested anything other than a woman making a decision. Greer cross-examined him, trying to suggest that Pruitt was biased by his relationship with the Vanes, that his memory of a months-old event was unreliable, that he could not truly know what Rosalind had felt in that moment. Pruitt listened to each question with the patience of a man who drove a wagon up a mountain once a month and was accustomed to tedious journeys. "I can't tell you what she felt," Pruitt said. "I can tell you what I saw. She stood up straight, and she looked that man in the eye, and she went where she chose to go. That's what I saw." Felder came next and presented the survey, the amended claim documentation, the proper filing records, the timeline demonstrating that Silas had held a legitimate and documented interest in the Northeast Ridge for 7 years, that the amended claim had been filed through proper channels before any legal challenge had been raised. Greer tried to attack the survey's methodology. Felder looked at him over his spectacles with the expression of a man who had been doing this since before Greer was old enough to read legal documents and said, "The methodology is standard. If you'd like to dispute it, you're welcome to produce a counter-survey. That takes approximately 3 months." The judge made a note. Then Rosalind submitted the written accounts, Francis's 2 dense pages, Margaret's short, precise, single page. She had a clerk read them into the record, which meant every word Margaret had heard Caldwell say, the specific words, the particular contempt in them, the things he'd said close enough for her to hear that the crowd had not, became part of the official proceeding. Caldwell sat very still through this. The kind of stillness that is not Silas's stillness, not the stillness of a man at rest, but the stillness of a man managing something. After Margaret's account was read, Greer requested a recess. Judge Marsh granted 15 minutes. In the hallway, Rosalind stood with Silas and Felder and Pruitt, and nobody said much because they'd all learned by this point that what was happening, and the best thing to do was let it. Silas put his hand on her shoulder, briefly, once. She put her hand over his, briefly. Felder looked out the window at the street. Greer is going to pivot, he said. He'll drop the duress argument and try to shift to the land claim directly. He can't, Rosalind said. The amended filing is airtight. That's why you filed it in Millerton. He knows that. He's going to try to argue jurisdiction. She thought about this. It won't work. The preliminary claim predates any challenge by 3 years, and the amended filing was registered before the hearing was called. I know it won't work, Felder said. I'm telling you what he'll try because it's all he has left. She nodded. Then we're fine. We're fine, Felder agreed in the tone of a man who did not use the word fine lightly. They went back in. Greer did exactly what Felder had predicted, and Judge Marsh listened to the jurisdictional argument with the expression of someone watching a person try to walk through a wall. Not unkind, not impatient, just observing the attempt with the certainty of knowing how it was going to end. When Greer finished, she said, Is that your complete argument, Mr. Greer? Your Honor, the Caldwell Commercial and Land Company believes. I asked about your argument, not your client's beliefs. She looked at the papers in front of her, turned a page, turned another. The room was very quiet. The marriage contract between Silas Vane and Rosalind May Vane, née Harper, is valid, she said. The testimony and documentation presented demonstrate clearly that the arrangement was entered into voluntarily by both parties, that no coercion was exercised by either side, and that the circumstances Mr. Greer has characterized as duress constitute, in this court's judgment, an unfortunate business practice on the part of the plaintiff's client, rather than legal grounds for invalidating a signed contract. She paused. The land claim amendment filed by Silas Vane on the northeast ridge of Black Ridge Mountain is registered as presented and is not subject to contest under any challenge arising from the marriage proceedings, as the filing predates the challenge by 6 weeks. She took her glasses off. The petition is denied. All claims associated with it are dismissed. She looked at Caldwell directly, and for the first time something that was not quite neutrality moved through her expression, not anger, not contempt, but a specific kind of clarity. Mr. Caldwell, I am familiar with the business model you've been operating in this county. I want you to understand that this court will review, with considerably more scrutiny than it has previously applied, any future legal actions originating from your office. Caldwell said nothing. He looked like a man who had swallowed something and was deciding how to manage the process. Greer said, Your Honor, we reserve the right to— You may reserve whatever you like, Judge Marsh said. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down. Rosalind felt the sound of it pass through her chest. She sat very still for a moment while the room moved around her. Greer gathering papers, Caldwell's extra men shifting toward the door, Felder saying something to Pruitt that she couldn't hear. She sat still because the feeling that had arrived in her chest when that gavel came down was something she needed a moment to receive properly. Silas was beside her. She could feel the fact of him there without looking. Rosalind, he said. I know, she said. I know. She looked at her hands in her lap, at the file, closed now, its work done. She thought about the woman who had packed it, sitting at that table on Black Ridge Mountain in the lamplight, writing and rewriting, building the thing page by page with the particular stubbornness of someone who had stopped believing that effort was wasted. She had not been certain it would work. She had not been certain of anything except that she was going to try with everything she had, because that was the only thing she knew how to do with a situation that mattered. Across the room, Caldwell was putting on his hat. He looked at her once, briefly, on his way to the door. The surface smile was gone. What was underneath it was smaller and harder and considerably less polished. It was the face of a man who had lost and knew it and was already calculating what came next. She met his eyes and held them and did not look away. and after a moment he looked away first and walked out the door without a word. Pruitt exhaled audibly. "Well," he said, "about that drink." "A deal's a deal," she said. They had the drink in the hotel dining room, which served whiskey at any hour if you were in the right kind of situation, and Pruitt had his and Felder had his, and Silas held his without drinking much of it because he was not much of a drinker, which Rosalind had observed over the months without comment. She had a small glass of something and let the afternoon light come through the window and felt the particular quality of a thing that has been finished. Not perfectly. Nothing finished perfectly. Caldwell was not gone. A man like that didn't go. He would recalculate and redirect and find another angle because that was the only thing men like him knew how to do with defeat. The silver on the northeast ridge remained, and remaining silver had a way of continuing to attract people who wanted it. The mountain would need watching. Their position would need maintaining. But the claim was registered. The marriage was standing. And Everett Caldwell had walked out of a courthouse in front of a judge who had put him on notice. And that was something real and durable that no amount of future maneuvering could entirely undo. Felder left for Millerton that afternoon. At the door of the hotel, he shook Silas's hand. A longer handshake than strictly necessary, the kind that says things the men involved are not going to say out loud. And then he turned to Rosalind and said, "You should have been a lawyer." "I thought about it once," she said. "What stopped you?" "Money. And the fact that women can't practice in most courts." Felder looked at her over his spectacles. "Most courts. Not all." "Not all," she agreed. "Not anymore." He nodded, once, with the satisfaction of a man filing something away for future reference. Then he went to his mule and rode south, and she watched him go with the feeling that she was watching something she wanted to remember. They stayed one night more in Harlan's Fork because the stage back to Millerton didn't run until morning. And that evening Silas and Rosalind ate dinner in the hotel dining room at a table by the window, and the food was unremarkable, and neither of them felt the need to fill every silence, and it was, she thought, the most comfortable meal she'd eaten in years. Which was saying something because the meals on Black Ridge Mountain had stopped being uncomfortable somewhere around the end of the first week. "What do you want to do?" Silas asked at some point in the middle of the meal. He said it without particular preamble, which was his way. "About what?" "The deposit. Now that it's properly registered. Felder says developed correctly it could—" "I know what Felder says." She put her fork down, thought about it. "Not yet." He looked at her. "Not for years, maybe," she said. "Not until we understand what it would do to the mountain, to the valley, to Copper Ridge." She paused. "You were right 7 years ago. You were right that it needed to wait. You just—" She looked at him. "You waited alone. That's the part that was wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "I was afraid," he said, and she could hear what it cost him to say it plainly. Not of the silver, of what it would bring, of having to— He stopped. Of having something worth protecting and not being able to protect it. That's a reasonable thing to be afraid of. I let it close me down. "Yes," she said, "you did." She didn't soften it. She had found that he did better with the unvarnished version of things. "And then you rode into Copper Ridge and paid double for a woman nobody wanted and brought her up a mountain and let her in anyway. So." He looked at his plate. Something moved across his face. "You're going to hold that payment over me indefinitely, aren't you?" "The double payment? Probably." She picked her fork back up. "It's a good detail." He looked up at her and the smile came, full, unhurried, the real one, the one that rearranged his face entirely and made him look like the man he was underneath the years of careful weathering. And she looked at it and let herself look at it without cataloging it this time, without counting it, just received it as what it was. The ride back up Black Ridge Mountain was cold and long, and Dobb was in a cooperative mood, which made a difference. The valley floor passed below them as they climbed, the familiar geography of the lower trail giving way to the particular dark density of the upper pines, and then the cabin clearing appearing ahead of them the way it always did, gradually and then all at once. She went in first and built the fire up from the banked embers and put water on for coffee, and by the time Silas had unsaddled Dobb and come inside the cabin was beginning to warm, and she'd set 2 mugs on the table and the fire was doing what fires on mountain nights are built to do. He came in and took off his coat and hung it on his hook. She had her coat on her hook. The two hooks, side by side, that was something she noticed now. The small, ordinary geometry of two people sharing a space. He sat down. She sat across from him. Outside, the mountain wind was doing its usual work in the high pines. That low, enormous sound that she had learned to sleep through and had come to find, without quite deciding to, something like reassuring. The sound of something too large to be argued with, simply being itself. She thought about Copper Ridge, about the square, the line, the laughter, about a travel document in the dirt and the particular quality of a crowd that has decided you are a joke. She thought about the woman who had stood at the end of that line with her face very still and her hands not shaking and her hope folded up small somewhere beneath her ribs, waiting, as hope does, without any good reason to. That woman had not known what she was walking toward. She had not known about the mountain, or the silver, or Caldwell, or Clara, or the books on the shelves, or the fiddle on the wall, or the man who would sit across from her over bad cornbread and say, "Eat," like it was the most natural thing in the world. She had known only that she was still standing, and that she intended to keep standing, and that somewhere there had to be a room that was the right size for her. There was. It turned out to be this one. She picked up her coffee. So did he. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "The fiddle?" She looked at where it hung on the wall. "Will you play it again someday?" He followed her gaze to the instrument, sat with the question the way he sat with all questions, taking it seriously, not rushing toward an answer just because an answer was expected. "Maybe," he said finally, "when you're ready." "When I'm ready?" He looked at her. "You want to hear it?" "I think I'd like to," she said. "When it's time." He nodded, looked at the fiddle once more. Something in his face, not grief exactly, not anymore, but the particular quality of a grief that has been sitting long enough to start, slowly, to become something else. Not gone. Changed. "All right," he said, like a promise that didn't need ceremony. She drank her coffee. He drank his. The fire burned down slowly, the way a good fire does when it's fed properly, and they sat in the warmth of it while the mountain did what it had always done around them, enormous and unhurried and entirely indifferent to the small and considerable struggles of the people who had chosen to build their life on its side. They were still there. That was the thing. Not because it had been easy or inevitable or arranged by any force beyond their own stubborn decisions. Not because they were without difficulty or damage or the ordinary failures of people trying to figure out how to occupy the same space without losing themselves in it. They were still there because they had chosen to be, clearly and repeatedly, in the ways that choice actually shows up in a life. Not in the dramatic moments, but in the quiet, unremarkable ones. The morning bread, the evening fire, the telling of the true thing instead of the comfortable one. The staying when leaving would have been simpler. Nobody in Copper Ridge would have predicted it. That was all right. The people in Copper Ridge hadn't known what they were looking at. Rosalind May Vane, formerly Harper, set her empty mug on the table and looked across it at the man who had paid double for the privilege of her company and had never once, in all the months since, seemed to regret it. She thought she probably didn't regret it either. She was certain enough of that for both of them, and she was a woman who had learned to be precise about what she was certain of. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. She went to the back room. She did not close the door all the way. She lay down on the quilts and listened to the sound of him banking the fire for the night, careful, deliberate, the way he did everything. And outside the mountain breathed in the dark, patient and immovable, the same as it had always been. She closed her eyes. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, which was not a thing she'd ever expected to be able to say, and the fact that she could say it now, quietly, without drama, as a simple truth about the shape of her life, was the thing she would carry longest from everything that had happened. Not the courtroom, not the square, not even the moment on the road when the crowd fell silent and a man she didn't know pointed at her and said her like it was the simplest word in the world. Just this. The room. The fire going down in the next room. The mountain outside, the The door not quite closed. Enough, more than enough. Finally, undeniably, enough.